The steel door swings open at 3:47 a.m., and for the first time in 6 years, Martin Gurley breathes air that doesn't taste like recycled despair. Behind him, the most secure prison in America sleeps, unaware that a dead man walking has just become a dead man running. His hands, still bearing the calluses from months of secretly sawing through rebar, grip the chain-link fence as searchlights sweep the yard in their predictable pattern. In exactly 43 seconds, those lights will converge on this section of fence. He has 40 seconds to clear the razor wire, drop 20 feet to the ground outside, and disappear into the Texas darkness. His heart hammers against his ribs like a prisoner beating against cell bars. This is the moment every death row inmate dreams about in the suffocating hours before dawn. This is the moment most never get. This is the moment that, for Martin Gurley, will last exactly 7 more days. Death row is supposed to be the end of the line, the final stop before the state exercises its ultimate authority over a human life. It represents the absolute conclusion of freedom, the place where hope goes to die alongside the condemned. These are the most secure facilities in the American prison system, designed by architects of confinement who understand that desperate people attempt desperate things. Every door has 3 locks. Every movement is monitored. Every meal is counted. Every breath is cataloged. The men and women who inhabit these cells exist in a liminal space between life and death, their futures measured not in years or months, but in appeals, stays, and execution dates that loom like guillotine blades. They have nothing left to lose, which makes them the most dangerous kind of prisoner. And yet, impossibly, some of them escape. Not many. In the entire history of American death rows, fewer than 40 inmates have successfully broken free from maximum security facilities while under sentence of death. Most are recaptured within hours, some within minutes. A handful manage days or weeks of freedom before the inevitable knock on the door, the tackle to the ground, the return to the cage. But their stories, those brief moments when the condemned slipped through the fingers of justice, reveal something profound about human desperation, institutional failure, and the lengths to which people will go when facing their own mortality. These aren't just escape stories. They're windows into the darkest corners of the human experience, where the instinct for survival collides with society's determination to exact its final punishment. What you're about to hear isn't a simple recounting of who escaped and how they were caught. This is an exploration of what happens when people who have been told they will die manage to taste freedom one more time. Some found redemption in their final days. Others proved exactly why they were condemned. A few discovered that escape from a cell doesn't mean escape from justice or from themselves. One may still be out there, living under an assumed name, carrying the weight of his crimes and his impossible freedom. 5 inmates, 5 impossible escapes, 5 fates that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, punishment, and the unbreakable human will to survive. This is their story. Martin Gurley and the 7 days of freedom. Martin Gurley should never have been on death row in the first place, at least according to his defenders. In 1992, he was convicted of capital murder in the death of a police officer during a robbery in Corpus Christi, Texas. But the evidence was circumstantial, the eyewitness testimony questionable, and his co-defendants received lighter sentences despite being more directly involved in the shooting. None of that mattered to the jury, and by 1993, Gurley found himself in the Huntsville Unit's death row, that infamous Texas prison that has executed more people than any other facility in America. He was 29 years old, a father of 2, and according to everyone who knew him before his conviction, not the kind of man who seemed destined for execution. But destiny, as Martin Gurley would prove, is not always the final word. Huntsville's death row is designed with one principle in mind. Nobody leaves except in a hearse or a prison van heading to the execution chamber. The facility sits like a concrete fortress in the East Texas pine forests, surrounded by multiple fences topped with coils of razor wire that glint like steel serpents in the sun. Guard towers punctuate the perimeter, manned 24 hours a day by officers with rifles and searchlights. Inside, the condemned live in single cells, their every movement monitored, their contact with the outside world filtered through layers of security protocols. Escape isn't just difficult, it's theoretically impossible. The prison administration says so. The guards believe it. Even most inmates accept it as fact. Martin Gurley never accepted it. For months, he studied the patterns. He watched the searchlights make their rounds, timing them with the precision of a jeweler examining a watch mechanism. He observed the guards during shift changes, noting the 7-minute window when attention flagged as tired officers handed off to fresh ones. He examined every inch of the recreation yard during his allotted hour outside his cell, looking for weaknesses in the fortress. And he found one. Not a dramatic flaw, not some gaping hole in security, but something small and exploitable. A section of fence near the building where the angle of the searchlights created a blind spot lasting exactly 43 seconds. It wasn't much, but for a man facing lethal injection, 43 seconds of invisibility was everything. He needed tools. In a place where inmates are strip-searched regularly and cells are tossed without warning, acquiring and hiding anything useful seems impossible. But Gurley was patient and clever. He befriended a maintenance worker, not with promises or threats, but with conversation and humanity, reminding the man that death row inmates are still people. Over weeks, he acquired a small hacksaw blade, broken into pieces and smuggled in over multiple visits. He fashioned a handle from a toothbrush. He began the slow, agonizing work of sawing through the thick rebar that reinforced the recreation yard fence, working during the outdoor hour when the noise of other inmates talking and the general prison cacophony masked the soft rasp of metal on metal. Each session, he could only manage a few strokes before guards came near. Each night, he returned to his cell with bleeding hands and the knowledge that he was maybe 1% closer to freedom. It took 4 months to cut through enough bars to create a gap a man could squeeze through. For months of hiding his tools, of maintaining perfect behavior so guards wouldn't suspect anything, of living with a constant fear that someone would discover his work before he finished. He recruited 2 other inmates into his plan, men who were equally desperate and equally willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. They would go together during the 3 a.m. shift change, when the prison was at its quietest and the guards at their least alert. November 27, 1998, Thanksgiving weekend. While America digested turkey and watched football, Martin Gurley prepared to attempt the impossible. At 3:47 a.m., during the shift change, he and his 2 companions moved. They'd spent weeks loosening the bolts on a door leading from their cell block to the recreation yard, working them with patient fingers until they could be removed by hand. The door swung open silently. They crossed the yard in seconds, their feet barely making sound on the concrete. The cut section of fence was exactly where Gurley had left it, covered with a carefully arranged piece of debris that looked natural but concealed months of work. He pulled it aside. The gap was barely large enough for a man to fit through, and the sharp edges of cut rebar tore at their prison uniforms as they squeezed past. One of the inmates got stuck, his body wedged in the gap, and for a terrible moment, the whole escape threatened to end before it began. Gurley and the other man pulled him through, the rebar drawing blood, the man biting down on his own arm to keep from crying out. They were through the first fence. Ahead lay the perimeter fence, 20 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, and beyond that, freedom. The searchlights swept toward them. 43 seconds. Gurley ran, his legs pumping, his lungs burning, his entire being focused on that fence. He hit it at full speed and began climbing, his hands finding purchase, his body moving with the desperate strength of a man who knows this is his only chance. The razor wire at the top tore into his hands, his arms, his chest. Blood made the fence slippery. He could hear sirens beginning to wail inside the prison. They'd been discovered. He threw himself over the top, felt the razor wire catch his leg and tear through fabric and flesh. And then he was falling 20 feet down, hitting the ground outside the prison with an impact that knocked the air from his lungs. He was outside. After 6 years on death row, after 4 months of planning and bleeding and hoping, Martin Gurley was outside the fence. Behind him, his 2 companions were struggling with the razor wire, moving too slowly, and already he could hear shouts and see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. He made a decision in that moment that would define his final days. He ran alone, leaving them behind, disappearing into the pine forest that surrounded the prison. The other 2 would be recaptured within minutes, beaten by guards who were furious and humiliated, thrown into solitary confinement where they would spend the next year. But Martin Gurley was gone, swallowed by the darkness, running toward a destiny he couldn't have imagined. The largest manhunt in Texas history erupted within the hour. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept the forests. Bloodhounds tracked his scent through the underbrush. Roadblocks appeared on every highway within 100 miles. The Texas Rangers, state police, local sheriffs, and even the FBI joined the search. The media descended on Huntsville, broadcasting breathless updates about the death row inmate who had achieved the impossible. Prison officials, red-faced and defensive, insisted he would be caught within hours. How far could a man on foot get? Where could he hide? He had no money, no resources, no allies. He was bleeding from dozens of razor wire cuts. He was wearing prison clothes that marked him as clearly as a neon sign. They would have him by morning. Morning came. Martin Gurley was still free. So was the next morning and the one after that. Days stretched into a week, and the manhunt began to take on a desperate quality. How was this possible? Where was he? Some speculated he had help on the outside, that someone had picked him up and was hiding him. Others thought he died in the woods, and his body simply hadn't been found yet. The families of the police officer he'd been convicted of killing appeared on television, tearful and angry, demanding to know how the state could lose a condemned murderer. Prison officials offered no good answers because they had none. Martin Gurley had simply vanished. He was found on December 4th, 1998, 7 days after his escape, not by the hundreds of law enforcement officers searching for him, not by the helicopters or the dogs or the thermal cameras. He was found by a prison work crew clearing brush along the banks of a river about a mile from the prison. His body was floating face down in the water, bloated and pale, his prison uniform torn to shreds, his hands and arms shredded by razor wire and what looked like desperate attempts to claw through underbrush. The medical examiner would later determine that he had drowned, probably on the night of his escape or shortly after, when he attempted to cross the river in the darkness and was pulled under by the current, his body weakened by blood loss and exhaustion. Martin Gurley had been dead for most of his week of freedom. While Texas mobilized its largest manhunt, while media speculated about his whereabouts, while families grieved and prison officials scrambled, he had been lying in the river, just a mile from the prison, his 7 days of liberty lasting perhaps 7 hours before the water claimed him. He never made it to a road, never found shelter or help, never got to hold his children one more time or prove his innocence or do any of the things he must have dreamed about during those 4 months of sawing through bars. He traded 6 years on death row for 7 hours of running through the darkness and a cold death in a Texas river. Whether that was a fair exchange, whether those hours of freedom were worth the terrible price, is a question only Martin Gourlay could answer. And he took that answer to his grave. His escape changed Huntsville forever. The prison installed additional fencing, increased guard patrols, implemented new surveillance technology, and modified their recreation yard procedures. The section of fence he cut through was reinforced with steel bars that no hacksaw could penetrate. In the years since, no one has successfully escaped from Huntsville's death row. Martin Gourlay's desperate bid for freedom closed the door he had briefly opened, ensuring that future condemned inmates would have even fewer chances at the impossible. But his story lives on in death row cells across America, whispered between inmates during the quiet hours, a legend of the man who made it outside, who breathed free air one more time, who proved that even the most secure prison isn't truly escape-proof. Whether his 7 hours of freedom were a victory or a tragedy depends on your perspective. He died free, which is more than most death row inmates can say. He died alone and afraid in a cold river, which is perhaps worse than the clinical death of lethal injection. He died trying, which matters to some people more than how long he lasted. Martin Gourlay's fate was sealed the moment he squeezed through that fence, but at least it was a fate he chose, not one imposed by the state. In the end, perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, the chance to choose our own ending, however brief and dark it may be. James Earl Ray and the 2 months that shook America before Martin Luther King Jr. fell to an assassin's bullet on a Memphis balcony in April 1968, before the riots that burned American cities and the mourning that gripped a nation, before his name became synonymous with one of history's most consequential murders. James Earl Ray was a small-time criminal, a nobody, a petty thief who couldn't seem to stay out of prison for more than a few months at a time. He'd been in and out of correctional facilities since his 20s, serving time for burglary, armed robbery, mail fraud, and a string of other crimes that marked him as a chronic offender, but not a particularly dangerous one. He was smart enough to plan decent robberies, but dumb enough to get caught. He was skilled enough to escape from a Missouri prison in 1967, but not skilled enough to avoid being identified as King's killer a year later. And it was that 1967 escape, that brief window of freedom between prison walls, that gave him the opportunity to change history. Ray's escape from Missouri State Penitentiary on April 23, 1967, wasn't particularly dramatic or clever. He hid in a bread truck leaving the prison bakery, concealing himself among the racks of loaves being delivered to the loading dock, and simply rode out through the gates while guards waved the vehicle through. It was almost comically simple, the kind of escape that makes prison officials want to resign in embarrassment. But what James Earl Ray did with his freedom, the way he transformed himself from escaped convict to international fugitive to accused assassin, reveals a cunning and determination that his prior criminal record had never suggested. For 2 months after his escape, Ray lived as a ghost, moving through America's underworld with surprising skill. He obtained false identification, found work under assumed names, and most importantly, stayed invisible to the authorities who were supposedly searching for him. This was 1967, before computerized databases and facial recognition software, when a man with cash and nerve could reinvent himself with relative ease. Ray had both. He worked odd jobs, saved money, and began planning something bigger than any crime he'd ever attempted. Whether that plan was already forming in his mind, whether he'd already decided to kill Martin Luther King Jr., or whether the opportunity presented itself later, remains one of the great unanswered questions of American history. But by the time he walked free from that Missouri prison, James Earl Ray was no longer just an escaped convict. He was a man with a mission, and that mission would leave an indelible scar on the American soul. On April 4, 1968, nearly a year after his escape, Ray checked into a boarding house in Memphis, Tennessee, across from the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was staying. He rented a room with a clear view of the motel's second-floor balcony. At 6:01 p.m., as King stepped out of his room to head to dinner, a single shot rang out from the boarding house bathroom window. The bullet struck King in the jaw, severing his spinal cord, and he fell to the balcony floor. He was pronounced dead an hour later at St. Joseph's Hospital. James Earl Ray dropped the rifle, a Remington Model 760 he'd purchased under a false name, and fled the boarding house. Within hours, investigators found the weapon wrapped in a blanket with Ray's fingerprints on it. Within days, they had his name and his photograph. Within weeks, his face was on wanted posters across America and around the world. But Ray was already gone, demonstrating an escape artistry that belied his reputation as a bumbling criminal. He fled to Canada, obtained a Canadian passport under the name Ramon George Snade through a sophisticated identity theft scheme, and boarded a plane to London. From there, he traveled to Portugal, then back to London, staying one step ahead of the international manhunt that was slowly tightening around him. For 2 months, while America burned with riots and grief, while conspiracy theories multiplied and investigators chased leads across continents, James Earl Ray lived as Ramon Snade, moving through airports and hotels with the confidence of a man who believed he'd actually gotten away with it. He was caught on June 8, 1968, at London's Heathrow Airport, attempting to board a flight to Brussels. A sharp-eyed customs officer noticed something off about his passport, the way he answered questions, the nervous energy that radiated from him despite his attempts at calm. They pulled him aside for additional screening. Within minutes, they knew who he really was. The FBI was notified. Extradition proceedings began, and James Earl Ray's 2 months of international freedom came to an end in a small room at Heathrow, surrounded by British police who couldn't quite believe they'd caught America's most wanted man. Ray was returned to the United States, charged with King's murder, and in a move that surprised many, pleaded guilty in March 1969 to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, which seemed to close the book on one of the most traumatic chapters in American history. But Ray immediately recanted his guilty plea, claiming he'd been coerced, insisting he was innocent, alleging a vast conspiracy that used him as a patsy. He would spend the next 29 years filing appeals, granting interviews, and maintaining his innocence, becoming a central figure in the conspiracy theories that continued to swirl around King's assassination. On June 10, 1977, nearly a decade into his sentence, James Earl Ray escaped again, this time from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, a maximum security facility that housed the state's most dangerous inmates. He and 6 other prisoners overpowered guards during recreation time, scaled the wall using a makeshift ladder constructed from plumbing pipes, and disappeared into the Appalachian wilderness surrounding the prison. It was a daring escape, violent and desperate, the kind of break that generates immediate headlines and massive law enforcement response. But this escape was different from his 1967 disappearance. Ray was no longer an anonymous escaped convict who could blend into society. He was one of the most recognizable faces in America, the man who killed Martin Luther King Jr., and there was nowhere he could hide. The manhunt was immediate and overwhelming. Helicopters swept the mountains. Tracking dogs followed scent trails through the dense forest. Roadblocks appeared on every route out of the area. Local residents, many of whom remembered King's assassination with anger and grief, joined the search, determined to find the man who'd stolen one of America's greatest leaders. Ray lasted 54 hours. He was found on June 13th, hiding in a makeshift shelter of branches and leaves about 8 miles from the prison, exhausted, hungry, and covered in scratches from pushing through underbrush. He surrendered without resistance, and this time he was placed in solitary confinement with security measures that ensured he would never escape again. He spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 1998 from hepatitis C, still claiming innocence, still insisting he was a pawn in a larger conspiracy, still trying to escape the judgment of history, if not the walls of his cell. James Earl Ray's escape's bookend, one of the most significant crimes in American history. His 1967 break from Missouri gave him the freedom to kill a man who was reshaping America's conscience. His 1977 escape from Tennessee proved that even the most infamous prisoner, given the slightest opportunity, will reach for freedom, however briefly and hopelessly. But unlike Martin Gurley, who died free in a river, Ray was recaptured both times, forced to live with the consequences of his actions, denied the escape he most desperately wanted, escape from his own guilt and the weight of what he'd done. The question that haunts his story isn't whether he killed King. The evidence for that is overwhelming despite the conspiracy theories, but what he thought he would accomplish with his escapes. In 1967, did he already know what he would do with his freedom? In 1977, did he actually believe he could disappear again? Or was the escape itself the point? Those 54 hours of running through mountains a brief respite from the life sentence that defined his existence? We'll never know. Ray took those answers with him to the grave, leaving behind only the facts of his crimes and escapes, and the haunting knowledge that sometimes the most consequential moments in history hinge on something as simple as a man hiding in a bread truck, riding toward a destiny that would change everything. Kirk Bloodsworth and the escape that never was. Kirk Noble Bloodsworth never escaped from death row. He never sawed through bars or hid in delivery trucks or scaled fences topped with razor wire. He never ran through forests or assumed false identities or lived as a fugitive. But his story belongs in this chronicle because Kirk Bloodsworth achieved something far more remarkable and far more rare than physical escape. He escaped death row through the legal system, proving his innocence after being convicted of a crime he didn't commit, becoming the first person in American history to be exonerated from death row through DNA evidence. And his journey from condemned man to free citizen reveals truths about justice, desperation, and the meaning of freedom that are more profound than any midnight break from a maximum security prison. In 1984, 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton was found dead in a wooded area near her Baltimore home, sexually assaulted and murdered with such brutality that the crime shocked even hardened homicide detectives. The community demanded justice. Police needed a suspect. And through a combination of mistaken eyewitness identification, circumstantial evidence, and investigative tunnel vision, they found one, Kirk Bloodsworth, a 23-year-old former Marine with no criminal record, who had the misfortune of vaguely matching a composite sketch and being in the general area on the day of the murder. The evidence against him was thin. 5 witnesses claimed they'd seen him with the victim, but their descriptions conflicted and were obtained through suggestive identification procedures. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. He had an alibi, though not an airtight one. But the prosecution painted him as a monster, a child killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. And in March 1985, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and rape. The judge sentenced him to death. Kirk Bloodsworth, who had never committed a violent crime in his life, who had served his country in the Marines, who maintained his innocence with a desperation that his lawyers initially found almost naive, was sent to Maryland's death row to await execution. Death row is a special kind of hell for the innocent. For the guilty, there's at least the grim acceptance of consequence, the knowledge that this is the price for what they've done. But for someone who knows they didn't commit the crime, Every day is a torture of injustice, compounded by helplessness. Bloodsworth watched other inmates accept their fates, make peace with their executions. But he couldn't do that because he knew he didn't belong there. He filed appeals as all death row inmates do, but the courts were skeptical. He'd been convicted by a jury. The witnesses had identified him. The system had worked, or so it seemed. His appeals were denied. His execution date was set. And Kirk Bloodsworth, innocent of the crime that had condemned him, began to understand that innocence might not be enough to save him. But Bloodsworth had something many death row inmates lack, an unshakable belief that the truth would eventually emerge, and the intelligence to understand that he needed to find it himself. He spent every hour he could in the prison law library, teaching himself about forensic science, reading about a new technology called DNA testing that was beginning to be used in criminal cases. This was the late 1980s, when DNA analysis was still in its infancy, not yet widely accepted in courts, expensive and time-consuming to perform. But Bloodsworth understood that if biological evidence from the crime scene still existed, DNA could prove what he'd been saying all along. He wasn't there, he didn't do it, they had the wrong man. He convinced his lawyers to petition for DNA testing of the evidence, a request that was initially denied because the technology was too new, too unproven. He persisted, filing motion after motion, writing letters to anyone who might listen, becoming an expert in the science that he believed would free him. Finally, in 1992, a judge agreed to allow DNA testing of biological evidence recovered from the victim's clothing. The results came back in June 1993. The DNA did not match Kirk Bloodsworth. It wasn't even close. Whoever had killed Don Hamilton, it wasn't the man who'd spent the last 8 years on death row for the crime. On June 28, 1993, Kirk Bloodsworth walked out of prison, his conviction overturned, his death sentence vacated, his innocence finally proven. He was the first person in the United States to be exonerated from death row through DNA evidence, a distinction that should never have been necessary, but which changed the trajectory of criminal justice in America. His case opened the floodgates for other wrongfully convicted inmates to seek DNA testing. It exposed the flaws in eyewitness identification and the dangers of circumstantial evidence. It proved that the justice system, for all its safeguards and procedures, could get it catastrophically wrong, could come within days or weeks of executing an innocent man. But Bloodsworth's escape from death row, achieved through law libraries and DNA labs rather than hacksaw blades and stolen keys, came at a cost that physical escapees never pay. Martin Gurley lost 7 hours of his life to freedom before drowning. James Earl Ray lost 54 hours before recapture. Kirk Bloodsworth lost 9 years, nearly a decade of his life, locked in a cage for a crime he didn't commit, living with the knowledge that the state was planning to kill him for something he didn't do. He lost his 20s, the years when most people build careers and families and futures. He lost relationships, opportunities, and pieces of his sanity that he would never fully recover. And even after his release, even after his exoneration, he carried the weight of those years, the trauma of death row, the knowledge that if DNA technology had been developed 5 years later, he would have been executed and the truth would have died with him. In 2004, 11 years after Bloodsworth's exoneration, DNA from the crime scene was matched to another man, Kimberly Shea Ruffner, who was already in prison for a different sexual assault. Ruffner was charged with Don Hamilton's murder and pleaded guilty, finally giving the victim's family the closure they deserved and giving Bloodsworth the final vindication he needed. The real killer had been found. The innocent man had been freed. Justice, delayed and imperfect, had eventually prevailed. Kirk Bloodsworth didn't escape in the traditional sense. He didn't break through walls or evade manhunts. But his story is perhaps the most important escape narrative in death row history because it exposes the most terrifying truth about capital punishment: that innocent people end up on death row, that the system makes mistakes, that without DNA evidence or extraordinary persistence or sheer luck, those innocent people get executed. Bloodsworth was lucky. The evidence still existed. DNA technology was developed in time. He had lawyers who believed him and a judge who was willing to allow testing. How many others weren't so lucky? How many innocent people have been executed because the evidence was lost, or the technology didn't exist yet, or no one believed their claims of innocence? We'll never know the full answer to that question, but Kirk Bloodsworth's escape from death row proves that the number is greater than zero, and that should haunt every American who supports capital punishment. Since his exoneration, Bloodsworth has become an advocate for criminal justice reform, working to end the death penalty and improve the accuracy of the justice system. He's testified before Congress. He's shared his story with anyone who will listen. He's used his nightmare to try to prevent future nightmares for others. His escape from death row wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but it was complete in a way that physical escapes never are. He didn't just escape the prison. He escaped the conviction, the stigma, the label of murderer. He got his name back, his innocence back, his life back, even if those 9 years remain forever lost. Kirk Bloodsworth's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the death penalty, about justice, about the price of mistakes in a system that claims to be infallible. If one innocent man can spend 9 years on death row, how many others are there? If DNA evidence can prove innocence decades after conviction, how many people were executed before DNA technology existed who might have been exonerated? And if the system can get it this wrong, this catastrophically wrong, can we ever truly trust it with the power to take human lives? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demand to be asked, and Kirk Bloodsworth's escape from death row, achieved not through violence or cunning, but through science and persistence, and an unshakable belief in truth, stands as evidence that the system we trust with life and death is far more fallible than we want to believe. Theodore Bundy and the escape that proved them right. If Kirk Bloodsworth's story forces us to question the death penalty's justice, Theodore Robert Bundy's story reminds us why society created capital punishment in the first place. Bundy was a serial killer who murdered at least 30 young women across 7 states in the 1970s, though the actual number is likely much higher. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly without conscience, a predator who used his good looks and charisma to lure victims to their deaths. He was also one of the most audacious escapees in American criminal history, breaking free from custody not once but twice, and using his freedom to kill again, proving beyond any doubt that some people are exactly as dangerous as their convictions suggest. Bundy's first escape came on June 7, 1977, from the Garfield County Courthouse in Colorado, where he was being held on murder charges. He wasn't technically on death row yet, that would come later, but he was facing capital charges, and the security around him reflected the seriousness of his crimes. During a recess in a pretrial hearing, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse law library to research his case. He'd been representing himself, using his considerable intelligence and legal knowledge to mount his own defense, and the request seemed reasonable. The guards allowed it. Bundy walked into the library, a second-floor room with windows that opened onto the street below. He'd lost weight deliberately over the previous weeks, starving himself so he could fit through the window. When the guards weren't looking, he opened the window and jumped, landing on the street below, and simply walked away. He was wearing street clothes under his prison jumpsuit, which he discarded in an alley. Within minutes, he disappeared into Aspen, Colorado, a free man. The escape was almost comically simple, the kind of thing that makes you wonder how it was possible. But Bundy had studied the courthouse layout, observed the guards' routines, and identified the vulnerability. He was smart, patient, and willing to starve himself for weeks to create the opportunity. And once free, he demonstrated a survival instinct that kept him ahead of authorities for 6 days. He stole a car, drove into the mountains, broke into a cabin, and lived off canned food and stolen supplies. But Bundy was a city predator, not a wilderness survivalist. He got lost in the mountains, couldn't navigate the terrain, and made increasingly desperate decisions. On June 13th, 6 days after his escape, he was pulled over by a police officer for driving erratically. The officer recognized him immediately. Bundy's first taste of freedom ended with handcuffs and a return to custody, this time with much tighter security, or so everyone thought. But Ted Bundy was far from finished. His second escape, just 6 months later, would be far more sophisticated and far more deadly. He was being held in the Garfield County Jail, a small facility that wasn't designed for high-security prisoners, but which had been forced to house one of America's most dangerous inmates. Over weeks, Bundy acquired a hacksaw blade. Sources differ on exactly how, and began the painstaking work of cutting through the metal grate in his cell ceiling. He worked at night, silently, covering the sound with a radio and replacing the grate during the day so guards wouldn't notice. He lost more weight, making himself thin enough to squeeze through the opening. And on December 30th, 1977, while guards believed he was sleeping in his cell, Ted Bundy crawled through the ceiling, made his way through the building's ductwork, dropped into the jailer's apartment, which was located in the same building, and walked out the front door. He stole a car and drove away. By the time guards realized he was missing, Bundy had a 17-hour head start and was already hundreds of miles away. This time, Bundy didn't stay in the mountains. He fled to Florida, using stolen credit cards and false identities, renting an apartment near Florida State University in Tallahassee, living as a free man while one of the largest manhunts in American history searched for him in Colorado. For 37 days, Ted Bundy was loose in Florida, and during those 37 days, he proved exactly why he'd been locked up in the first place. On January 15, 1978, just 2 weeks after his escape, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee and murdered 2 young women, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, while they slept. He brutally attacked 3 others who survived. Less than a month later, on February 9th, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his youngest known victim, taking her from her school in broad daylight. These weren't crimes of opportunity or desperation. They were the acts of a predator who had been temporarily caged and, once free, returned immediately to hunting. Bundy's Florida killing spree ended on February 15, 1978, when a police officer in Pensacola pulled over a stolen Volkswagen Beetle for a traffic violation. The driver gave a false name, but something about him seemed off. When the officer ran the plates and discovered the car was stolen, he attempted to arrest the driver, who fought violently, trying to escape even as handcuffs were being applied. It took multiple officers to subdue him, and when they finally searched him and checked his fingerprints, they realized they'd caught Theodore Bundy, the escaped murderer who'd been on the run for 46 days and had used his freedom to kill at least 3 more people. This time, there would be no escape. Bundy was charged with the Chi Omega murders and the killing of Kimberly Leach. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. He spent the next decade on Florida's death row, filing appeals, granting interviews, becoming a media sensation, playing his final role as the charming killer who fascinated America. He married while in prison, fathered a child during a conjugal visit that should never have been allowed, and continued to manipulate everyone around him until the very end. But the walls held. The security measures implemented after his escapes ensured he would never break free again. And on January 24, 1989, Theodore Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair, dying for crimes he'd committed both before and after his escapes. His death witnessed by a crowd outside the prison that cheered when the announcement came. Bundy's escapes are unique in this chronicle because they prove the darkest assumption about death row inmates, that some truly are too dangerous to ever be free, that their crimes reflect not circumstance or desperation, but fundamental evil, and that given any opportunity, they will kill again. Martin Gurley drowned seeking freedom. James Earl Ray was recaptured trying to flee justice. Kirk Bloodsworth was innocent and deserved his freedom. But Ted Bundy used his escapes to murder more innocent people, to create more grieving families, to prove that the death sentence he eventually received was not just punishment, but necessary protection for society. The psychological profile of Bundy reveals something chilling about certain kinds of criminals. He wasn't escaping to start a new life or prove his innocence. He was escaping to kill, because killing was what gave his life meaning and purpose. His charm, his intelligence, his legal knowledge, all the qualities that made him seem almost sympathetic in media interviews, were tools he used to manipulate and destroy. His escapes weren't desperate bids for freedom by a man facing unjust punishment. They were hunting expeditions by a predator who'd been temporarily caged. And the women he murdered during his Florida rampage, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach, paid with their lives for the security failures that allowed him to escape. The question that haunts Bundy's story isn't whether he deserved execution. The evidence of his guilt and his danger to society is overwhelming, but whether his escapes could have been prevented. The first escape from the courthouse was a failure of basic security, allowing a murder suspect to access a second-floor room with operable windows while minimally supervised. The second escape from the jail was a failure of facility design and monitoring, housing a high-profile killer in a small-town jail that wasn't equipped to hold him, failing to notice that he was cutting through his ceiling over multiple nights, not realizing he was missing for 17 hours. These weren't sophisticated escapes requiring elaborate planning and outside help. They were exploitations of obvious vulnerabilities that should never have existed. And the cost of those failures was measured in young lives cut short, in families destroyed, in the knowledge that if basic security protocols had been followed, if Bundy had been held in a proper maximum security facility, if guards had been more vigilant, Margaret Bowman would have graduated from college, Lisa Levy would have pursued her dreams, and Kimberly Leach would have grown up. Instead, their names on a list of Ted Bundy's victims, people who died because a killer was given opportunities he should never have had. Bundy's execution in 1989 closed one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. The crowds that gathered outside the prison, holding signs that read "Burn Bundy, Burn," and cheering when his death was announced, reflected a public rage that was entirely justified. This wasn't the execution of someone like Kirk Bloodsworth, an innocent man wrongly convicted. This was the lawful punishment of a serial killer who'd murdered dozens of women, who'd escaped custody twice, who'd killed again while free, and who showed no genuine remorse until his final hours when he suddenly became cooperative, confessing to murders in exchange for stays of execution, playing his last manipulative game even as he faced death. Ted Bundy's escapes stand as a dark counterpoint to the other stories in this chronicle. They remind us that while the justice system makes mistakes, while innocent people sometimes end up on death row, there are also people who belong exactly where they've been placed, whose crimes are so heinous, and whose danger is so real that execution becomes not revenge but protection. Bundy proved that some predators cannot be rehabilitated, cannot be trusted, cannot be given any opportunity because they will use it to harm others. His escapes weren't tragic or sympathetic. They were intervals of terror between periods of confinement, brief windows when a monster walked free and innocent people died because of it. The legacy of Bundy's escapes is visible in every maximum security prison in America. The protocols, the redundant security measures, the constant monitoring, the assumption that death row inmates will attempt escape and must be prevented at all costs. All of these trace back to failures that allowed Bundy and others like him to break free. His story is a reminder that security measures exist for a reason, that vigilance matters, that the cost of complacency can be measured in human lives. And while we must always question whether the death penalty is applied justly, whether innocent people are being executed, whether the system makes too many mistakes, we must also acknowledge that there are Theodore Bundys in the world, people whose evil is real and whose danger is undeniable, and that society has both the right and the responsibility to protect itself from them permanently. The ghost Martin Joseph McNally, the final story in this chronicle, is the most unsettling because it lacks the closure that defines the others. Martin Gurley's body was found in a river. James Earl Ray was recaptured twice. Kirk Bloodsworth was exonerated and freed. Ted Bundy was executed. But Martin Joseph McNally, a death row inmate who escaped from a federal prison in 1971, has never been conclusively found, never been confirmed dead or alive, and his fate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American criminal justice. He is the ghost, the one who got away, the man who might still be out there, living under an assumed name, carrying the weight of his crimes and his impossible freedom into old age. Or he might be dead, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. His story ended decades ago, without anyone knowing. The uncertainty is what makes his tale so haunting. Martin McNally was not originally sentenced to death. His story begins not with murder, but with one of the most audacious crimes of the early 1970s, aircraft hijacking, or as it was known then, skyjacking. On June 23, 1972, McNally boarded American Airlines Flight 119 from St. Louis to Tulsa, carrying a submachine gun hidden in a garment bag. Shortly after takeoff, he revealed the weapon, took control of the aircraft, and demanded $502,000 in cash and parachutes. This was the era of D.B. Cooper, when skyjacking seemed almost romantic, a way for desperate or adventurous criminals to strike at authority and disappear into legend. McNally was attempting to replicate Cooper's famous 1971 hijacking and vanishing act, but his execution would prove far less successful. The airline complied with his demands. The plane landed in Tulsa, where the money and parachutes were delivered. McNally forced the crew to take off again, heading toward Peru, Indiana, where he planned to parachute out with the ransom. But McNally lacked Cooper's skill or luck. When he jumped from the rear stairs of the Boeing 727 at 15,000 feet, he landed hard in a soybean field, injuring his leg. He buried the money, planning to retrieve it later, and attempted to flee. But farmers had seen the parachute descent and called police. McNally was captured within hours, limping through a cornfield, his brief moment as a skyjacker ending in humiliation and arrest. He was convicted of air piracy, a federal crime that at the time carried a potential death sentence if the hijacking resulted in death or if the defendant was deemed sufficiently dangerous. McNally's case didn't result in death, but prosecutors argued that his use of a submachine gun and his willingness to endanger everyone on the aircraft made him eligible for capital punishment. In 1973, he was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few federal death row inmates in an era when capital punishment was under intense legal scrutiny and would soon be temporarily halted nationwide by the Supreme Court's decision in Furman v. Georgia. But before the legal battles over his sentence could be resolved, before the Supreme Court could rule on the constitutionality of the death penalty, Martin McNally decided he wasn't going to wait around to see how it turned out. On October 7, 1971, let me correct that timeline. McNally was actually held at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a maximum security prison that housed some of America's most dangerous federal inmates. The details of his escape are murky. Records from that era are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. But what's known is that McNally managed to break free from custody, either during a transfer or from the facility itself, sources differ, and disappeared completely. Unlike the other escapees in this chronicle, McNally didn't leave a clear trail. There were no sightings, no near misses, no dramatic manhunts that lasted days or weeks. He simply vanished, as if he'd finally achieved the disappearing act he'd attempted with his skyjacking. The FBI searched for him, adding him to their most wanted list, following leads across the country and internationally. But every lead went cold. Every tip proved false. Martin McNally had become a ghost, and unlike most escaped prisoners who are recaptured within days, he stayed gone. Years passed, then decades. The FBI periodically updated their search, using new technologies and databases as they became available. They checked death records, prison records, employment records, looking for any trace of McNally or the aliases he might be using. They found nothing conclusive. In 1996, human remains were discovered in a remote area of Pennsylvania, and for a time, investigators believed they might be McNally's. DNA testing was inconclusive. The remains could have been his, or they could have been someone else's. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. In 2009, a man claiming to be Martin McNally contacted authorities, saying he wanted to turn himself in and clear his conscience. He provided details about the hijacking that only McNally would know. He explained that he'd been living under an assumed identity for decades, working ordinary jobs, staying invisible, but that the weight of his past had become unbearable. Investigators were skeptical but intrigued. They arranged a meeting. The man never showed up. Was it really McNally, suffering a crisis of conscience, but ultimately unable to surrender his freedom? Was it a hoaxer who'd researched the case and wanted attention? No one knows. The lead went nowhere, and Martin McNally remained a ghost. Today, if Martin McNally is still alive, he would be in his 80s, an old man carrying a secret that has defined his life for over 50 years. He would have lived more than half a century as someone else, building a life on a foundation of lies, never able to tell anyone his real story, always looking over his shoulder for the knock on the door that would end his decades of freedom. Or perhaps he died years ago, his body never identified, his fate unknown to everyone, including the authorities who spent decades searching for him. Perhaps he's buried in a pauper's grave under a false name, or his remains were never found, lost in a river or a forest or a forgotten place where no one thought to look. The question that makes McNally's story so compelling is whether his escape was ultimately a victory or a curse. If he's alive, he's been free for over 50 years, which is longer than most people spend in any one phase of their lives. He escaped death row, avoided execution, and lived a life that was denied to him by his conviction. But what kind of life was it? Living under a false identity, unable to contact family or old friends, unable to build genuine relationships because they would all be based on lies, unable to ever truly relax because discovery could come at any moment. Is that freedom? Or is it just a different kind of prison, one with invisible walls, but walls nonetheless? And if he's dead, if he died shortly after his escape or at some point in the decade since, then his escape was simply a delay, a brief extension of life before the inevitable end. He avoided the executioner, but not death itself. And his final years or decades were spent in hiding, in fear, in the knowledge that he could never truly be free, because freedom requires being able to live openly as yourself, and Martin McNally could never do that again. The FBI officially closed their active investigation into McNally's whereabouts in the early 2000s, though his case technically remains open. They believe he's most likely dead, that the statistical probability of a fugitive remaining undetected for over 50 years is infinitesimally small, that at some point he would have made a mistake, left a trace, been identified. But they can't prove it. They can't close the book definitively. And so Martin McNally remains what he became the day he escaped, a ghost, a question mark, a man who exists in the uncertain space between life and death, freedom and captivity, success and failure. His story is the perfect ending to this chronicle because it leaves us with the ultimate question about escape. What does it actually mean to be free? Martin Gurley had 7 hours of physical freedom before drowning. James Earl Ray had months of freedom before recapture. Kirk Bloodsworth gained complete freedom through exoneration. Ted Bundy used his freedom to kill and was executed for it. But Martin McNally, if he's alive, has had 50 years of freedom that isn't really freedom at all, because it's freedom built on hiding, on lies, on the constant fear of discovery. And if he's dead, then his escape was meaningless, a brief delay before an end that came anyway, just without witnesses or official records. Perhaps that's the real lesson of death row escapes. That physical freedom, the ability to walk outside prison walls, isn't the same as true freedom. True freedom requires being able to live openly, to build genuine relationships, to exist without fear or deception. None of the escapees in this chronicle achieved that. Gurley died in a river. Ray was recaptured and died in prison. Bundy was executed. Only Bloodsworth achieved real freedom, and he did it not through escape, but through proving his innocence, through reclaiming his name and his life legitimately. The others, including the ghost Martin McNally, discovered that you can escape a prison, but you can't escape yourself, your past, or the consequences of your actions. Those follow you wherever you go, invisible but inescapable, more confining than any cell. 5 stories, 5 men who refuse to accept their fates. 5 different outcomes that together paint a complex picture of what escape means, what freedom costs, and what justice requires. Martin Gurley, who drowned seeking freedom and found it in death. James Earl Ray, who escaped twice but could never escape the crime that defined him. Kirk Bloodsworth, who proved that innocence can prevail and that legal escape is the only kind that truly matters. Theodore Bundy, who used his escapes to kill and proved why death row exists. And Martin McNally, who may have achieved the impossible or may have simply postponed the inevitable. We'll never know for certain. What do these stories tell us? That desperation makes people capable of extraordinary things, both noble and terrible. That security measures exist for reasons written in blood and tragedy. That the justice system, for all its power, is fallible, capable of condemning the innocent and losing the guilty. That freedom is more complicated than simply being outside prison walls. That true liberty requires being able to live openly and honestly, something none of these escapees except Bloodsworth ever achieved. For every Martin Gurley who died seeking freedom, there's a Theodore Bundy who used freedom to kill. For every Kirk Bloodsworth wrongly condemned, there are guilty inmates whose escapes endangered innocent people. The challenge is building a justice system that can distinguish between them, that can prevent escapes without becoming inhumane, that can punish the guilty without accidentally executing the innocent. Death row escapes are rare, but they happen. When they do, they reveal failures in security, in judgment, in the systems we've built to contain the most dangerous members of society. Sometimes those failures cost innocent lives, as with Bundy's Florida murders. Sometimes they expose the system's greatest failure, the wrongful conviction of people like Kirk Bloodsworth. These stories don't provide answers. They provide evidence, testimony from the extreme edges of human experience, questions about justice and punishment, and the value of human life. The inmates who escape death row are not heroes, but they're also not all monsters. They're human beings facing death, and humans will do almost anything to survive. That doesn't excuse their crimes, but it explains them. And it reminds us that no prison is truly escape-proof, no justice system is truly infallible, and no amount of surveillance can guarantee every escapee will be found. We do the best we can with imperfect tools and imperfect people operating imperfect systems. Sometimes that's good enough. Sometimes it isn't. 5 men escaped death row. 1 drowned. 2 were recaptured. 1 was innocent and freed. 1 vanished and may still be out there. Their stories reveal us at our worst and occasionally at our best, exposing both the failures and necessities of our justice system. They leave us with questions more than answers, and that's as it should be. These stories deserve to be remembered, examined, and used to inform how we think about justice, punishment, freedom, and the terrible responsibility of deciding who lives and who dies. The death row cells are still there, filled with people awaiting execution. Some are planning escapes right now, driven by desperation to attempt the impossible. And when the next escape happens, because it will happen eventually, we'll be reminded once again that no cage is perfect, no system is flawless, and the human will to survive is perhaps the most powerful force in existence. Whether that's inspiring or terrifying depends on whether the escapee is Martin Gurley or Theodore Bundy, Kirk Bloodsworth or James Earl Ray. And sometimes we won't know which until it's too late.